There is a moment you know well, even if you have never described it to anyone. Something happens, maybe small, maybe not, and before you have taken a single breath, before a single coherent thought has formed, you are already somewhere else entirely. Your chest has tightened, your jaw has set, a voice in your head has already reached its verdict, and the person standing in front of you, or the email sitting open in your inbox, or the memory that arrived without invitation at 3 in the morning, has already changed the quality of the entire day. You did not choose this. You did not decide to feel the way you feel. It arrived and you went with it, and now everything downstream of that moment is colored by something you never consented to. You have tried to manage this. You have told yourself to calm down, to breathe, to think before you react. You have read the advice and followed it, and still found yourself, weeks later, in the same conversation, making the same face, feeling the same tight, familiar grip of something you thought you had already worked through. And the exhausting part is not even the emotions themselves. It is the sense that your own mind is not entirely yours. That something in you is faster than your thinking, louder than your reasoning, and that all your efforts at control are applied after the fact, like trying to redirect a river by moving sand with your hands once it has already flooded the banks. What I want to offer you today is not another technique for managing your reactions. I want to offer something more fundamental than that, something that changes the ground beneath the whole problem rather than the symptoms on the surface. Because the reason your attempts at emotional control have not fully worked is not that you lack discipline or self-awareness. It is that you have been working with an incomplete understanding of what thought actually is and how it relates to the surging interior weather we call emotion. There is a philosophy here, one that the political thinker Hannah Arendt arrived at, through a very different route than most people expect, a philosophy not of suppression or performance, but of genuine inner freedom. And it begins not with your emotions at all, but with a question about thinking itself. Most of us, when we speak of thinking, mean the process of reaching conclusions. We think through a problem, we arrive at an answer, we act. Thinking in this common sense is instrumental. It is a tool for getting somewhere. And because we understand it that way, we tend to assume that emotional reaction and thinking are simply in competition, that when feelings are strong, reason goes quiet, and when reason asserts itself, feelings are pushed aside. The whole framework of emotional control rests on this assumption. The emotions are hot and fast, the mind is cool and slow. The task is to let the mind win. But this picture, which nearly everyone has absorbed without examination, is not accurate, and its inaccuracy is precisely what makes it so difficult to act on. Hannah Arendt made a distinction that most people never encounter, and once you do encounter it, you cannot unsee it. She distinguished between thinking and cognition. Cognition is the instrumental process, the problem-solving, the reasoning toward conclusions, the calculation of consequences. This is what most people mean when they say they want to think clearly. But thinking, in her deeper sense, was something altogether different. Thinking, for Arendt, was not about reaching conclusions. It was about remaining in genuine contact with experience, with the question, with the reality of what is. Thinking in this sense does not produce answers. It dissolves the false certainties that prevent us from seeing clearly in the first place. It is the capacity to step back not from your emotions, but into yourself, into the interior space where you are in genuine dialogue with your own experience, rather than simply being carried along by it. This distinction matters enormously for what we are talking about, because when people say they want to think clearly, in moments of emotional intensity, what they usually mean is that they want their cognition to override their feeling. They want the calculating mind to step in and correct the reacting body, but this is exactly backward. Cognition does not liberate you from emotion, it merely adds a layer of narrative on top of it. You feel angry, and then you think about why you are angry, and the thinking produces more material for the anger to attach to. This is not thinking clearly. This is cognition in the service of emotion, dressed up to look like reason. What Arendt was pointing toward was something different. A genuine withdrawal into the thinking space, not to produce conclusions, but to make contact with the reality of your experience without being identical with it. If this sounds abstract, Consider the actual phenomenology of what happens when you react strongly to something. There is not, if you look carefully, a clear sequence of first feeling and then thought. What there is an interpretation that arrives so quickly it feels like sensation. Someone says something dismissive in a meeting, and before you register it as dismissal, something in you has already moved. But what has moved is not a raw emotion independent of meaning. It is a meaning that has been read into the moment so fast that it feels precognitive. Your mind has already told a story, already decided what was intended, what it says about you, what it confirms about the world. The emotion is not separate from this story. It is the story experienced as feeling, which means that the emotion is not the obstacle to clear thinking. The obstacle is the speed and the invisibility of the story. This is where Arendt's understanding of the two in one, her phrase for the internal dialogue of genuine thought, becomes practical in a way that surprises most people who encounter it. Arendt observed that genuine thinking requires a kind of doubling. The thinking person becomes both the one who asks and the one who answers. There is a genuine internal conversation, not the false one where you argue with yourself without moving from your starting position, but a real opening of questions, a real willingness to not yet know. The two in one is not a technique you perform, it is a capacity you develop by practicing being uncertain, by being willing to inhabit a question without rushing to its resolution. And what it produces over time is the ability to encounter your own emotional states with the same quality of attention, to be the one who notices the anger and the one who does not yet know what the anger is actually about. If you have found something useful in what I have just said, consider subscribing to this channel. I explore these territories every week, and I would love to have you as part of this ongoing conversation. Most of what we call emotional control is, in reality, emotional suppression dressed in respectable language. The advice to count to 10, to take a breath, to pause before responding is not wrong in itself. But it is often understood as a strategy for muting or delaying the emotional signal so that cognition can take over and produce a more socially acceptable output. This understanding keeps the fundamental problem intact, because what suppression does, even sophisticated suppression, is drive the emotional content underground. It does not examine it. It does not make contact with it. And underground is where the material continues to shape everything, the tone of your voice when you think you are being neutral, the accumulation of managed moments that eventually produces something neither managed nor small. I want to say something that many of you watching this already sense, but may not have had words for. There is a loneliness in being someone who feels things intensely and has learned to manage those feelings very well. There is something isolating about being skilled at control, because the control itself becomes a kind of distance, not just from others, but from your own experience. You have spent so long learning not to be swept away that you may have forgotten what it felt like to simply be present to your own interior life, without either drowning in it or watching it from behind glass. Tell me in the comments, how long have you been carrying the weight of managing yourself? How long has it been since you felt that your inner life was something you could trust rather than something you needed to govern? If words feel difficult right now, just write this: I need the quiet too. That is enough. And when you write it, know that someone else will read it and feel less alone in the exact same exhaustion. The question of how to think clearly in moments of emotional intensity is really a question about what kind of relationship you have with your own inner life. And here is the insight that changes everything. Clarity is not the absence of emotion. Clarity is the presence of awareness. These are not the same thing, and treating them as the same is what produces the endless frustration of trying to think well when feeling strongly. Awareness does not require the feeling to go away. It requires only that there be some interior space between the feeling and the person who is having it. Not distance, space. The difference between distance and space is crucial. Distance is separation. Space is room to move. Distance is achieved by pushing something away. Space is cultivated by becoming larger than the feeling, not by growing the ego, not by becoming more defended, but by deepening the capacity for genuine attention. Hannah Arendt's concept of thinking was intimately connected to what she called withdrawal from the world of appearances. This phrase sounds mystical, But it is not. It refers to something very specific and very ordinary. When you are in a social situation, when you are being seen and evaluated and responded to, a significant portion of your attention is dedicated to managing your appearance, how you are coming across, what is being thought of you, what role you are playing. This is not vanity. It is simply what it means to exist in a social world. But this orientation toward appearance makes genuine thought very difficult, because genuine thought requires turning inward, toward the interior conversation. What this means practically is that the moments when you most need to think clearly, confrontations, disagreements, high-stakes conversations, are the moments when the conditions for clear thinking are most severely compromised. You are at maximum exposure, maximum performance pressure, and your interior attention is directed almost entirely outward. This is not a problem that can be solved in the moment. It is a problem that requires cultivation outside the moment. Arendt understood this deeply. She believed that the capacity for thought was not a talent some people had and others lacked, but a practice that had to be developed through the deliberate creation of thinking time, genuine solitude, not the passive scrolling or consuming kind, but the active interior kind where you sit with something, a question, an experience, a conflict, and allow the two in one to do its work. When you build this practice, something remarkable happens over time. The interior space that thinking cultivates comes with you when you return to the world of appearances. It is faint, certainly, and the noise of social life is loud. But there is a thread back to it, a faint but reliable path to the thinking space, even in the middle of a charged conversation. This thread is what allows you to be present to your emotional experience without being identical with it. Let us be very concrete about what this looks like. You are in a difficult conversation. Something is said that triggers a strong reaction. The old pattern would be to have the reaction and then manage it, to feel the flush of anger or the contraction of shame and then apply control. The new pattern does not begin in that moment. It begins long before it, in the accumulated experience of having sat with your own inner life often enough that you recognize its movements when they arise. When the trigger comes, instead of immediate collapse into the story the emotion is telling, there is a brief but real pause. Not the performed pause of counting to 10, but the genuine pause of someone who has learned to be curious about their own experience. What is actually happening right now? Not what should I do with this feeling, but what is this feeling actually about? This is the moment where cognition, in its proper role, can become useful. Not to override the emotion, but to examine the interpretation at its root. Arendt wrote extensively about the importance of what she called enlarged thinking, a term she borrowed from Kant, which means the capacity to think from the standpoint of others, to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, to resist the automatic closure of judgment. Enlarged thinking is not empathy in the popular sense. It is not primarily about feeling what others feel. It is about the disciplined refusal to let your perspective be the only perspective you examine. When you practice enlarged thinking in moments of emotional intensity, you are not suppressing your reaction. You are expanding the frame around it, wide enough that you can see your own position as one position among several possible ones. And that expansion creates something very close to what people mean when they say they want to think clearly. There is a misunderstanding I want to address directly, because it is one of the most common reasons that people find philosophically informed approaches to emotion frustrating. The misunderstanding is that emotional intelligence should result in feeling less. That as you become more practiced at this kind of attention, the emotional weather should become less severe, the reactions less intense, the interior life more quiet and manageable. This is not what happens. What changes is not the intensity of the feeling, but your relationship to the intensity. You may feel just as strongly and yet not be claimed by it in the same way. The feeling passes through you rather than becoming you. And that is not a small thing. That is, in fact, a very large thing. It is the difference between weather that visits and weather that defines the landscape. Arendt had a concept of natality that is rarely applied to questions of emotional life, but is, I think, extraordinarily relevant here. Natality was her word for the human capacity for new beginnings, the capacity inherent in the fact of being born into a world that pre-existed, you and will outlast you, and yet into which you arrive as something genuinely new. Every person, she argued, carries within them the possibility of beginning something that was not already contained in what came before. In the context of emotional thinking, natality is the reminder that you are not the sum of your past reactions. You are not condemned to continue the patterns you inherited or established before you understood what you were doing. Every moment of genuine thought is, in a small but real sense, a beginning. Every time you choose the interior question over the automatic conclusion, you are exercising the natality that is, according to Arendt, the deepest expression of what it means to be human. This is not the optimism of self-help culture. It is not the claim that you can rewire your brain with enough positive thinking. It is something more grounded and more serious than that. It is the philosophical claim that the human capacity to examine experience and to begin again is not a special talent possessed by a few, but a structural feature of consciousness itself. You already have it. The question is whether you use it. And using it is not dramatic or extraordinary. It is the quiet, repeatable, often unremarkable practice of turning toward your own inner life with genuine curiosity, without the goal of fixing it or arriving somewhere, just making contact with what is actually there. If something in what I have been sharing has been opening a door for you, I want to invite you more fully into this conversation. There is a community of people gathered around these videos who are asking the same questions you are asking, sitting with the same exhaustion of trying to manage an inner life they were never fully taught to understand. I make these videos because I believe that philosophical thinking is not a luxury for scholars. It is a necessity for anyone who wants to live with genuine awareness, who wants to stop reacting from positions they never consciously chose. If that is you, consider subscribing, not as a transaction, but as a way of saying yes to continuing this kind of exploration. There are people here who will understand what you are going through, who are not waiting for you to have your life resolved before they welcome you. So if this feels like the right place, subscribe and come back. We will keep going deeper together. What then is the actual practice? Let me try to describe it not as a technique with steps, but as an orientation, a way of relating to your inner life that grows more natural the more you inhabit it. The first element is what we might call honest noticing. Not the noticing of surveillance, where you watch yourself in order to catch yourself doing something wrong, but the noticing of genuine interest, where you observe what is arising in you the way a naturalist observes weather, with curiosity rather than judgment. You feel irritation arising. You notice it, not immediately asking what to do with it, or whether it is justified, simply registering that this is what is present. The moment you notice, you have created a slight but real separation between the feeling and the one who is having it. You have become, if only for a moment, the observer, and not only the experiencer. And that is the beginning of the interior space Arendt was pointing toward. The second element is what we might call patient uncertainty. Most emotional reactions are accompanied by a powerful sense of certainty. You feel wronged, and you are certain you were wronged. You feel afraid, and you are certain the danger is real. Patient uncertainty does not mean dismissing any of these experiences. It means holding them as hypotheses rather than verdicts. It means being willing to ask, before accepting the conclusion the emotion is delivering, is this exactly what I think it is? Is the story the reaction is telling the most complete available story? This is not comfortable. Certainty is comfortable. But the willingness to inhabit uncertainty is the necessary condition for actually thinking, rather than simply reasoning more elaborately within the framework the emotion has already constructed. The third element is continuity of inner dialogue. Arendt was clear that the two-in-one, the internal conversation that constitutes genuine thought, is not something you can summon on demand in moments of crisis if you have not been practicing it in moments of relative calm. This is perhaps the most practically significant implication of her thinking for daily life. If you want to be able to think clearly when the emotional stakes are high, you have to be in the habit of thinking, of genuine interior conversation when nothing pressing is happening. This means that the practice is not primarily a crisis management strategy. It is a form of ongoing relationship with your own inner life, a relationship that you tend regularly, not because a crisis is approaching, but because this is how you want to live, in genuine contact with your own experience, rather than merely performing your way through it. Consider the specific texture of what thought produces when it is genuine. Not conclusions, but questions. Not answers, but the ability to sit with answers long enough to see whether they actually fit. When you encounter a strong emotion, and you have been practicing genuine inner dialogue, what happens is not that a cool, rational voice arrives to override the feeling. What happens is that a genuine question arises within the feeling itself. Why does this affect me so strongly? What is this really protecting? These questions do not diminish the emotion, but they change its function. Instead of being a signal that drives you forward into reaction, it becomes a signal that draws you inward into understanding. And understanding, not control, is the thing that actually changes how you move through the world. There is a paradox at the heart of everything we have been examining, and I want to name it clearly because paradoxes that go unnamed have a way of becoming silent sources of confusion. The paradox is this: the more you try to control your emotions, the more you are controlled by them. Not because the effort is wrong, but because the orientation of control implies a relationship of opposition, you against the feeling, reason against sensation. And opposition sustains the energy of what it opposes. The emotions you fight become larger in your inner life than the emotions you are simply willing to be present to. What is less often articulated is the philosophical dimension of this truth, which is that the movement from control to understanding is not merely a psychological adjustment. It is a change in your understanding of what you are. You are not a rational agent managing an emotional system. You are a thinking being whose emotional life and whose reflective capacity are both expressions of the same underlying consciousness. And when you begin to inhabit that understanding, not just intellectually but as a lived orientation, the opposition dissolves. You are not fighting yourself anymore. You are being yourself, fully, including the complexity and the difficulty and the feeling and the thought, all at once. That is perhaps the most honest answer I can give to the question this video poses. You control your emotions and think clearly, not by developing better strategies for the battle between feeling and reason, but by ending the battle. By developing the capacity to hold both your emotional experience and your reflective awareness in the same interior space without requiring one to defeat the other. This is what Arendt meant by the examined life, not a life where you have examined and resolved all the difficult material, but a life in which the activity of examination is ongoing, genuine, and not threatening, because you have built enough interior capacity to be present to yourself without being overwhelmed by what you find there. The next time something happens that would normally sweep you into reaction, you will not be a different person. You will still feel what you feel. The signal will still arrive, fast and insistent and carrying its interpretation. But somewhere in the moment after the signal, if you have been building this practice, there will be something that was not there before. A small but real pause. Not the pause of control, the pause of recognition. The moment where you notice that you are in here, aware, and that the feeling is also in here, present and real, and yet not the whole of what you are. In that pause, everything is possible. The point is not to guarantee the outcome. The point is to restore the condition of genuine freedom, the capacity to begin again, which Arendt believed was the most essentially human thing about us, and which no intensity of emotion, no force of habit, no history of reaction can permanently extinguish. It is always available. It is always here.